Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
Bloodstained Ritual of the Night remains one of the most successful and anticipated games in Kickstarter history. It's a game that may not have existed at all without the support of the community, yet like so many others before it, the road to completion was long and fraught with many challenges. But the game has arrived, and against all odds, it's good. So good, in fact, that it may just stand as one of the finest crowdsourced games to date. From my perspective, my expectations were met and exceeded. Unfortunately, not everything has gone according to plan. As Bloodstained arrived over the past couple of weeks, technical problems and unexpected bugs started to emerge, specifically on Nintendo Switch. Beyond that, after playing each console version, I was surprised to find such a significant difference between each of them. Multi-platform comparisons these days have become somewhat dull, but that is not the case here. So today I shall guide you through the world of Bloodstained across each and every console platform. What's up with the Switch version, and what's going on with the PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X versions of the game? Oh, and how does it stack up against the original backer demo? All that and more shall be yours on this episode of Digital Foundry.
Bloodstained.
From the beginning, Bloodstained promised a return to form for Igarashi and crew, a brand new game in the style of Castlevania Symphony of the Night and its kin. It's a compelling offer and one that clearly grabbed the attention of Castlevania fans, as the Kickstarter itself pulled in more money than just about every other game ever on the platform. It's an impressive feat. But it's also clear that development was difficult. Wii U and Vita versions were cancelled very early on, development duties were shifted around, and it took more than 4 years to complete. The result, however, is well worth it. It's a beautiful and beautifully playing take on the latter-day Castlevania games. With a massive game world to explore, a wide selection of abilities, excellent play control, and a brilliant presentation, it's the sort of game fans have waited for years. Mighty No. 9, this is not. Yet, this was not always the certain outcome. Last year, a beta demo intended for backers of the game was released. This is perhaps the first thing that jumps out at me, the degree to which the team has improved the visuals over time. While it was judged somewhat harshly initially, one must keep in mind that this is, of course, the reality of game development. Iteration is part of the process, and transparency during the developmental phase highlights this very clearly. The game was not finished, and it shows to the point where, when it did re-emerge earlier this year, the trailer itself poked fun at this very concept. Thankfully, those improvements highlighted in this trailer go beyond even what I expected. So let's begin with a direct comparison to the original demo, before we examine the various ports available now. To begin with, you can see that a lot has changed between the demo and the final game, just as they promised. The first village, for instance, is a great place to start. The beta demo is simple with unimpressive texture work, billboard trees, and a lack of contrast. It feels unrefined, and this is a sensation you'll experience throughout the beta version. The final game instead focuses more on dramatic lighting, new scene composition, and improved materials across the board. While the central game design is roughly the same, most of the artwork has been either completely recreated or heavily reworked. Areas such as this almost seem to lack proper lighting altogether in the original version, in addition to exhibiting very poor texture work. The final game in comparison is refined and beautiful to behold. The background work is obviously where most of the effort has been poured. Entire backdrops were redesigned and rethought out, while color choices and shading differ greatly between them. In its final form then, Bloodstained is a beautiful game. Each area is carefully crafted, with each structure within the world angled to look just right from the perspective of the player. Dynamic lighting is used everywhere, as are real-time shadows, and everything just looks right. I also love the use of clouds and mist throughout the game, especially the quickly moving clouds visible outdoors that kind of remind me of the entryway just before Dracula in Symphony of the Night. In fact, the game world is designed very much like Symphony of the Night. Each area is broken up into its own distinct zone, with connecting hallways used as transitions between them. Thankfully, while the initial loading sequence is rather long, once in game it all feels very seamless. Then there's the soundtrack, which of course is superb. Michiru Yamane once again serves as the primary composer on this project, and real instruments were used in producing the melodies. It's a score that perfectly fits the game, and it works beautifully here. While the visual style may not appeal to everyone, I think it's fair to say that this is one of the finest looking 2.5D action games this generation. Well, provided you're playing on the right platform. You see, since its release, there has been much said about the state of the Nintendo Switch version, but what about the other iterations? Well, the first thing I should note before we go any further is that the development team is currently focusing heavily on refining the Switch version of the game, so while I'm reporting on these issues in this video, it's certain to improve, at least we hope. The question for me is, to what degree can it be improved, and just what are the actual problems? Well, let's start with the basics though, the resolution across every platform. At the very top of the pile is the Xbox One X version, which impressively delivers a full native 4K experience. As with every version, the possibility of dynamic resolution cannot be fully ruled out, but after counting various shots across different environments in the game, I do feel that the resolution is either fixed at 4K or simply spends most of its time there. The point is, image quality is a strong point for Xbox One X. PlayStation 4 Pro, however, differs by a greater margin than usual. This version is limited to 1080p resolution, it seems, but that's not the whole story. The game appears to use Unreal's temporal upscaling in an attempt to give the impression of a slightly higher resolution, but it's not hugely successful, and all of the pixel counts still turn in 1080p. The base PS4 then seems to be straight 1080p, while Xbox One S delivers 900p, as you might expect. The Switch, however, is actually higher than I would have expected in all honesty, as Unreal Engine 4 titles on the Switch typically utilize very low resolutions. So when playing in docked mode, the Switch appears to hit 720p, at least most of the time. This is a very difficult game to pixel count due to its anti-aliasing and lack of free camera, but it does at least seem to deliver this. In portable mode though, resolution drops to 576p. Either way, I feel that one of the issues with the Switch version in particular is the anti-aliasing used here. It simply doesn't work all that well with such low resolutions, and the result is a rather smeary looking image. We'd be better off with a basic post-process AA instead, I feel. It may exhibit additional shimmering, of course, but as a result, it would appear much sharper overall. Honestly though, resolution really isn't the largest issue on Switch in terms of visual quality. Porting an Unreal Engine 4 title such as this to the Switch when Switch was not part of the original development plan is likely a very challenging task. Many of the areas that were pared back visually are rather similar to other ports such as Doom and Wolfenstein 2 when you get right down to it. The most noticeable difference lies in texture quality. The resolution of these textures takes a tremendous hit on the Switch to the point where it almost seems as if surfaces haven't fully loaded. Everything is just fuzzier and lacking the refined detail you get on the other platforms. Now in portable mode, the loss in detail isn't felt nearly as strongly as in docked mode due to the small screen, but it's really not great looking in either case. Beyond that, certain effects and techniques have been pared back significantly. The water shader used on the deck of the ship early in the game, for instance, has been simplified, though in some ways I almost kind of prefer the look of this section on Switch. The water itself is pared back as well though. This is supposed to be water, but again, you can see that it doesn't really resemble it on Nintendo's machine in comparison to the other versions. Also in other versions, light sources cast shadows as you run past them. But over on Switch, this feature has been disabled. The torches seen throughout the game are also displayed differently, and sometimes the edge of the texture used for this effect is weirdly visible. It doesn't look great. Another interesting trade-off can be found in these dialogue sequences. On all other platforms, the game scene is rendered in 3D behind the models during these sequences, so everything remains animated. That makes sense, right? Well, on Switch, just before a conversation, a snapshot is taken of the game screen and used as a background for the conversation. It's kind of a smart choice, even if it looks less impressive. That said, despite this, I do feel the cuts make sense, and ultimately, the game looks similar enough to the other versions to work. When porting something like Bloodstained, I feel the developers have made the right choices for the most part. Texture quality is the one area where perhaps it falls shortest, but still, the drop in visual quality is pretty much what you would expect from an Unreal Engine 4 game on the Switch that, again, wasn't designed for the system from the ground up. But unfortunately, there are other issues beyond just the visuals themselves. For one thing, there are crashes. Every version of the game seems to exhibit this issue, and in my case, they only occur when pulling a book from the bookshelves. So yeah, be sure to save before reading any books in this game. There's more though. Remember those conversations with static backdrops I mentioned earlier? Well, on the Switch, this feature occasionally breaks entirely, and you end up with a glitchy background instead. This happened several times during my playthrough. Then there's the loading. Throughout the game, loading times between areas tend to be somewhat lengthier on Switch, but it's not a huge problem. But there are a couple areas where it becomes downright awful. Take this spot. You need to jump up through this hatch to get to the next room. This requires holding the jump button. If you don't, you fall right back down into the scene from which you came, and this is how it's supposed to work on the other versions of the game. Over on Switch, however, this area requires significantly more loading, resulting in this lengthy black screen between each room. The problem here is that if you don't jump high enough, you fall back into the area you just jumped from. Since each instance of loading takes such a long time, however, this can quickly become frustrating. But perhaps the most significant issue with the Switch version is the input latency. From what I can determine, input lag is somewhere above 140 milliseconds, almost double that of the other versions. This means that the entire game feels heavy and unresponsive in comparison. This is the problem that really needs to be solved. Getting the input latency back down to a reasonable level will help the game just flat out play better. But yeah, that's a lot of nitpicking, no doubt, but not all problems are created equally. And like I mentioned earlier, the development team has a lot of fixes in the works. But of these problems, I feel that input latency is the most critical, followed by some of these loading issues. Sure, it would be nice to see improved textures and effects, but honestly, those are the types of changes I expected in the first place, so I don't feel it's a genuine problem. But what about PlayStation and Xbox? The primary difference here is indeed the resolution, but this boost has its drawbacks, as we'll see in a moment. But there's one other thing I want to mention first. The Xbox version triggers HDR when paired with an HDR compatible display, but it's not really supported. Instead, it simply tone maps the image into the appropriate color space, and as a result, really looks no better than SDR, and arguably worse. This does not occur at all on the PlayStation 4, mind you, and on Xbox you need to disable HDR in the dashboard to get around it. But really, when focusing on differences between each version of the game, performance is where it's at. This is a game that runs very differently on each machine, and all of them have their own issues to a degree. Let's start at the top. The best performer by far is PlayStation 4 Pro. Locked at just 1080p, this version holds 60 frames per second nearly all the time. It's a very stable game, but even still, it's not quite perfect. There's occasional hitches in certain areas of the game, like this. Also, this scene has become one of my favorite tests as it pushes the system a tad harder. As you see, the Pro gets close to holding that 60 frames per second line, but it's not 100% successful here. There are minor dips below that line. And up to this point, this was the most demanding area that I found, at least until later in the game. Still, by and large, the game really does run quite well on PS4 Pro, and if you're looking for the most fluid console release, this is the one to get. And that's precisely what makes its relationship with Xbox One X so interesting. The X version is pushing 4 times the number of pixels, and it looks much better as a result. But as a consequence, the frame rate is not as stable as it is on PS4 Pro. There's more inconsistencies along the frame time graph that pop up just during normal gameplay like this. If we jump to the same test sequence, it's immediately clear that the frame rate is noticeably worse than PS4 Pro, with sustained drops in the mid-50s throughout this section. However, after spending a lot of time with it, I do feel that it's still high enough not to be overly distracting, especially if you have a FreeSync display, I'd imagine. This really is a situation of image quality versus stability. If you're okay with dips like this during gameplay, go for the Xbox One X version, but if you prefer stability, the PS4 Pro is the one to play. But then we have the base consoles, and this is where things start to take a nosedive. First, there's the base PS4, which looks virtually identical to the Pro, but it doesn't run that way. The base experience is a lot worse, with slowdown rearing its head on a regular basis. Early on, the results aren't too bad, but as you progress, the frame rate really starts to plummet. Many scenes throughout the game struggle to hold even 50 frames per second, let alone 60. The tower climb here is much worse than the enhanced consoles, as you see. On average, it's about 10 frames per second lower than Xbox One X. At this stage, the fluidity of the experience just starts to feel somewhat compromised. But there's more. For this video, I've had to capture and play 6 different iterations of the game, which means it was not possible to play all the way through the game prior to completing this video. However, I did discover that a boss late in the game apparently has serious issues, and thanks to friends of Digital Foundry, I have some footage of it right here. Of course, I only have access to PS4 and PS4 Pro footage, but as you can see, this boss brings both systems to their knees. The base PS4 hits the mid-teens here. While PS4 Pro holds up only a tad better than that. This is, as far as I can tell, the slowest fight in the entire game, and while I can't test them, it's very likely that it's just as bad on the other platforms, so I think this boss fight needs some tweaking. Thankfully, it seems to be an outlier. Next we have Xbox One S, which reduces its resolution to 900p while turning in performance roughly equivalent to the base PS4. Which means these two base systems are pretty much the same in terms of playability, but you do get slightly improved image quality on the base PS4. But I think a lot of people are more curious about the Nintendo Switch version, and perhaps this one isn't quite as interesting as I expected. I went in expecting the worst based on Twitter comments, but the results aren't as bad as I expected. Basically, one of the major sacrifices made to get up and running on the Switch was the reduction in frame rate to 30 frames per second as opposed to 60. That's a huge difference, mind you, but that's exactly the kind of compromise you see in many Switch ports from other systems. So I wasn't surprised at all. And as you can see, the Switch seems to have no troubles hitting this level of performance. After playing through roughly 30% of the game on Switch, I found that the frame rate is really quite stable overall. There's occasional hitches here or there and some uneven spikes along the way, but by and large it's smooth. Well, at least as smooth as 30 frames per second can be. I think the issue here is that the frame rate combined with the high input latency results in a game that just feels a lot worse to play than any other version. And honestly, it's exactly the same in portable mode. It holds 30 frames per second just like docked. Now of course, things like that late boss fight with the poker chips probably run horribly on the Switch, but sadly I wasn't able to test this at all. Unless the performance takes a huge nosedive across the board later in the game, this version is pretty stable. And that's why I don't really expect to see huge improvements on the performance front. So what can we expect then? Well, the team has specifically noted that they are working to solve a number of issues, including input latency, elimination of the crash bugs, improvements to loading times, and other minor game engine tweaks. These should help improve the overall feel of the game significantly, especially the latency. On the other hand, I feel there's no feasible way they could hit 60 frames per second in this version. I believe it will remain 30 frames per second, as it's exactly the sort of trade-off we often see from Unreal Engine 4 and other engine ports such as this to the Switch. Yes, Yoshi's Crafted World and Travis Strikes Again are both 60 FPS Unreal Engine 4 games on Switch, but these were designed from the ground up for the system. Both run at even lower resolutions and feature tighter constraints on overall level design. As for the visuals themselves, I don't expect any real changes here either. Many folks have brought up the water shader on the deck of the ship early on to highlight a huge downgrade in visuals, but honestly this only accounts for one small section. The rest of the game is much closer to the other versions, but obviously things like texture detail are hugely reduced. Unfortunately, I don't think that this can be reasonably improved while also decreasing loading times, but hey, we'll find out soon enough, I guess. So yeah, overall, Bloodstained is a brilliant game with a few rough edges, especially on Switch. Yet I think it's worth playing and a worthy follow-up to Symphony of the Night. It has a sense of scale and grandeur that's more in line with Symphony as opposed to the portable follow-ups. They really nailed the core progression. This is a game that doesn't hold your hand. Progression is often somewhat unclear, and players are pushed to explore the world and play around with the various systems in order to find the way. It feels like a design straight out of 1997 in the best possible way. It's clear that the development team really understands what makes those games so special, and they don't go out of their way to guide you by hand through the experience. It's a very rewarding game to play. The master has definitely returned. But that's it for the moment. I'd like to extend a special thanks to friends of the show Gigaboots and ERG Apollo for their help capturing some late game footage for this video. With this project complete now, I can get back to the game myself, where I'll likely continue playing on PS4 Pro due to increased frame rate stability, though I have to admit the improved image quality on X is very appealing. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this look at Bloodstained, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top, and of course, follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.